Welcome to YOUTHTOPIA Talks. Today we will be exploring the topic, racial justice is climate justice. What if we can create change for a just world? Before we get started, firstly, a warm welcome to everybody tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people joining in from all over the world. A couple of fun facts from the audience joining us tonight. Our three major cities tuning in is Jakarta, Singapore, and Abu Dhabi. The youngest person watching is 13 years old, and our oldest is 27. We received 31 questions from the audience already prior to this when filling in the form, which we will try and address in the conversation. If not, for those of you watching, remember there is a chance for you to ask questions directly to the panelists during our Q&A section later in the conversation. My name is Malati. I'm 19 years old and the founder of YOUTHTOPIA and the co-host of today's event. I will be joined by my co-host, Maya.
Hi everybody, I'm Maya Nicholson. I'm 17 years old, currently based in Singapore. And Mel, actually, fun fact, the oldest person is 51 because my dad just decided to join us. Before we begin today's YOUTHTOPIA Talks, I would like to talk to you guys about some rules that we're just gonna abide by for some YOUTHTOPIA Talks etiquette. So first and foremost, please stay on mute throughout the talks. We don't want any interrupting. Secondly, aside from our speakers and myself as the host, please turn off your videos so we can ensure that there is maximum connectivity. Thirdly, I encourage everyone to keep commenting and asking questions on the chat because we love hearing what you guys have to say. Shout out to Etsa and Emma, our team, who will ensure the engagement. They're just the YOUTHTOPIA bubbles right now. And fourthly, if you would like to speak directly, please use the raise your hand button and we will unmute you, turn on your video during the Q&A section. And finally, please make sure to pin the videos of our speakers so that you can see them clearly throughout the event.
Thank you so much, Maya. Now, without further ado, let us begin today's event. YOUTHTOPIA Talks is one of the many initiatives within YOUTHTOPIA's Summer of Change campaign. Despite the pandemic, we believe in providing an online space for young changemakers to share knowledge regarding global issues and potential solutions for sustainable change. One of the many issues rampant in today's society is the lack of awareness and understanding on the intersectionality between racism and climate change. However, the Black Lives Matter movement has triggered an awakening to the reality of the world we're all living in today. It has challenged us to question the norms our society has deemed normal and change it to embrace all voices, all backgrounds, and perspectives.
One reality that has been overlooked is the relationship between racial injustice and climate change, but now has resurfaced and it needs further action to see the change we want to see for equitable solutions. To discuss what actions are needed and what youth can do to help, please join me in welcoming our incredible lineup of speakers today. Jamie Margolin from 0 Hour, Toby Thorpe, a climate justice advocate and YOUTHTOPIA Circle of Youth, and finally, Vic Barrett, a fellow from the Alliance for Climate Education. I'd just like you guys to quickly introduce yourselves and we can start with Jamie.
My apologies, I am currently in a car, so this is going to be an interesting experience. But my name is Jamie. I'm 18 years old. I'm a climate justice organizer. I live in Seattle, Washington currently, but my family on my mom's side is from Colombia, South America. I co-founded an organization called 0 Hour, which is a youth climate movement focused on mobilizing as many young people as possible to take climate action. Right now, we are also doing a big voter turnout initiative to try to get as many people to vote in the American elections as possible. I'm also the author of a new book called Youth to Power, which is like a guide to organizing for people who would like to get involved but don't know how yet. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah.
Awesome. Vic, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Vic Barrett. I'm 21 years old. I'm from New York, but sorry if you hear the siren in the background. I'm from New York, but I currently live in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm Afro-Indigenous and Afro-Latino. first generation Honduran American. Currently, what I'm mostly working on is I'm a democracy organizer with the Alliance for Climate Education. So I'm mostly trying to uplift climate justice issues in the context of getting young people out to vote and engaged with the government. So yeah, right now I'm mostly working on voter engagement, storytelling, and climate justice, and basically the intersections of that.
Cool. And Toby, finally, please introduce yourself to everybody.
Thanks, Maya. Hi, everyone. My name's Toby. First and foremost, just like to let you all know that I'm calling in today on stolen land of the land of Indigenous Australians, the Malakoti people, the Southeast Nations, or the white slang for that is I'm calling in from Tasmania in the Huon Valley. I'm 18 years old. I'm a full-time climate justice advocate in Australia. And for the last 6 years, I've been advocating to stop fossil fuel projects across the country of Australia as being the biggest exporter and influencer of fossil fuels in the world, but also educating and mobilising young people across the country as well to be able to stand up for the values that they believe in and ensure that the weight of the world being felt on the shoulders of young Australians is turned into action to develop a world that we all want. And that's me in a nutshell.
That's incredible. And thank you guys for your lovely introductions. And just thank you for joining us today. By the way, guys, we're juggling with 5 different time zones for our speakers. It's morning, night, evening. So I am just incredibly happy to see all of your faces joining us here tonight. We're going to just dive right in with a warm-up question, which is, who is your climate and justice activist role model or hero? And please tell us why. Anybody want to start with this one?
Yeah, so the people that I look up to the most, I guess my climate justice heroes, are the young people who started the No Dakota Access Pipeline movement here in the United States. Some of the individuals who I personally know and have worked with and are just really amazing, who are my heroes, are Tokata Iron Eyes and Jacelyn Charger. They are 2 young women who helped start the resistance against the construction of a big pipeline on Indigenous land. And that movement was really the No Dakota Access Pipeline movement is really what inspired me to really start Zero Hour and do that work. Like, I didn't think that I as just a girl had enough power to really take action until I saw the work that was done by a bunch of young people, especially women. Their bravery is really why I am who led the No Dakota Access Pipeline protest. So if you guys want to follow activists individually, I would encourage you, if you're on social media, to follow the International Indigenous Youth Council on Instagram and Twitter. That is organized by a lot of the young people that I'm talking about. Tokata Iron Eyes is just her name, or Jacelyn Charger on Instagram, and go support the work that they do. They are truly incredible, and they are the reason why I'm able to do what I am today. They are so inspiring, and I think everyone should go and support them. Those are my climate action heroes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jamie. We've been, even here in Indonesia, I've been following everything that's been happening, but thank you for giving us those insights to who and where we should go follow. Toby, what about you? Who do you look up to in this space?
Yeah, it's a tricky question for myself, really, because I don't really have an individual that I look up to. But coming from a place of privilege and a country that has, for so long put Indigenous people on the back burn, I think the solidarity and the determination, but also just the resilience that Indigenous people have in the fight for climate justice is what inspires me and motivates me to continue doing the work that I do. Because, although coming from a country that is sometimes portrayed as the dream country, or people grow up and want to go to Australia, really understanding the core roots of where our history is, and it's really, really horrific. But having an Indigenous population that is still so open and resilient and determined is what inspires me all the time.
Amazing. Thank you for that answer. And Vic, we're very curious to know who your activist hero is, so please let us know.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways my response kind of echoes what Toby and Jamie said, and I think that's what's awesome about the climate justice movement, that it is very grassroots and holistic in the sense that I think we're doing a lot to, remove the iconography of activism and actually just appreciating who's right next to you. Yeah, I feel like every young person I've met in this movement, their story, their experiences somehow contributed to inspiring me, to making me feel like I could keep doing this work. And I would especially shout out young Black organizers, particularly just because, from my own experience, I know the multiple front lines that Black folks are constantly fighting on. So definitely a lot of respect for Black people who maybe step back from other fights to be in the climate movement. So.
Thank you, Vic. I think every point that what was brought up here, I relate to as well, being an activist myself. And what I like to see are those common threads that keep coming back. Young change makers around us, wherever they are in the world, that is what drives us forward to the front lines, especially Indigenous wisdom as well. In the back there, we feel that driving us forward, understanding, acknowledging, respecting that wisdom. And moving towards, the discussion and the topic today, racial justice is climate justice. I want to backpedal here because we have more people joining us in this webinar. Hello, and thank you for joining us. For those of us that are learning, and perhaps also to position myself and Maya as the co-hosts, we do not want to pretend that we're experts in this topic. This is where we really want to position ourselves as learners from all of you on the front lines, and way better versed in this area. But let's start with a foundation, right? How does climate change and racial injustice share the same roots? Can you describe how the two issues are intertwined? Jamie, I would love to start with you.
Yeah, so I guess the basic roots of how climate injustice and racial injustice intertwine, it all started with colonialism and colonization, the whole idea that other people and lands can be taken and extracted from and used in a very abusive and extractive relationship. Starting with the colonization, that was really, a lot of people pinpoint the climate crisis to the Industrial Revolution, but the actual roots of the mindset and the systems that allowed us to get to a point where we are self-destructing our own society really starts with colonialism and colonization. And if you look at who feels the worst impacts of the climate crisis, colonialism and racial violence, the reason is because environmental injustice is a form of violence. So not having clean water, not having clean air, being in a place where the environment is very degraded and not ideal for people to live in, a lot of the folks in the ruling class are not going to subject themselves to that. They're going to make other people deal with that. So, for example, the way that it shows up today, like the remnants of this, is a lot of pipeline construction and a lot of, you're not going to see a pipeline built through, Beverly Hills, because the communities there by the government and by the corporations are seen as more valuable, and their lives are respected more. And that is a very wealthy white area, and people with wealth and with the privilege of whiteness are typically not, like, corporations and governments typically can't get away with harming people as much as they can when people exist at the intersection of economic oppression and racial oppression. At that intersection of economic and racial oppression, that's where corporations and governments can really do the most damage. And because of this goes back to the colonial history, because they have a history of getting away with it, and because that has been the norm for so long of just violence and violence and violence, they are continuing that legacy. And then there isn't as much of a pushback as much as in communities of color, low-income communities, people who are both low-income and folks of color. There isn't as much of a, they can kind of get away with it more because of our racist system that allows them to get away with it more. That the racist system and white supremacy that says that, certain people, certain races are held higher than others. So that's really, I guess, some of the basics of environmental racism, and I'll let my co-panelists talk a little bit more about that. I'd really encourage people to do a lot of reading after this panel as well. Just Google environmental racism and do some looking into that, and especially how colonial violence is very much linked to environmental degradation, and how when colonizers came, they extracted from the people and they extracted from the land in a very unhealthy and abusive way, and that has not stopped. Colonization is not something in the past. It's still happening. Most of the Earth's biodiversity is protected by indigenous people, and that is continually, like the colonization, like for example, in the Amazon rainforest, all over the world, like it's still happening. So there is the past colonization, but we also have to acknowledge that, like, the violence is continuing. It didn't stop. It's still happening, but it's just in different ways. So that's the basics, and I'll let my co-panelists take it away from.
Thank you, Jamie, for that. I think that is definitely a very informative piece that a lot of people needed to hear. I think the part about colonialism that is still continuing that violence is really, really interesting. I would love to hear Vic on this issue. I would love to talk to him about that. So Vic, if you would like to go.
I think that, a brief explanation of how they're connected is basically like, because at the roots, fundamentally, these issues are the same. When we say climate justice is racial justice, we're not just saying that it is because like fundamentally it's a call for the same thing, to dismantle systems that aren't working for us. I think that we need to remember, like these are the same fights. It's about taking apart these things that, like I just said, aren't working for us. And we need to remember, calls like defund the police shouldn't be considered like that much more radical than calls like divesting from fossil fuels, because it's about looking at the things that are harming us and that have been harming us for a long time, and letting people decide what systems can work better and moving towards that.
Yeah, thank you, Vic. I think that also really, it gave a lot more perspective to me, because as I said, I'm learning as we go through this conversation. And for me, especially, I've been, really, I guess in a way, this is a coping mechanism. And I'm sure, even I'd be curious to hear what some of the viewers are thinking about this topic. But for me, I had a hard time understanding that interconnectedness. I box things like, okay, if you're a social justice activist, you're focusing on just the social aspects without regarding the environmental aspects. But there is so much connection between the two. And I think that that's also a little bit deeper what we want to explore. So thank you, Vic, for your answer and highlighting that. Toby, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think to explain it essentially is I think we first need to understand climate justice in an explanatory sense, to say when we say climate justice, it's people who are feeling the effects first and worst are contributing the least amount to the problem. But then when we connect that link to racial injustices, we need to make the link to say, well, the systems that are in place that lead to the injustices of racism, or the long-standing racist policies and practices such as segregation or the unequal educational opportunities, or even most basically the limited opportunity to economic stance for that sort of thing, it sort of leads to climate justice to say the already existing policies and systems are in place, put these communities, put people of colour, low-lying communities, low-income families at the forefront of the climate crisis. Climate change hasn't caused racism. That was already an existing issue in a sense, very basically. But when we think about climate change, the systems and policies that already exist are putting those families, communities, and those people at the forefront of feeling the effects first and worst, even though they're not contributing to this problem at a larger scale to what white communities are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's really important to also acknowledge the fact that you said that, yes, racism already existed. It isn't here because of the climate problem, but both of them come hand in hand together and are interlinked because of this. I think that that's something really interesting that not a lot of people would have thought about before. So thank you for acknowledging that, and thank you for your answer. The next question that we're gonna head into was actually asked by someone, Tatiana Hermani. And the question is, how do we have difficult conversations with our families regarding this topic, especially when so many of them can be racist without even knowing it, built into culture? Who would like to take away this question? Vic, maybe we could start with you.
I'm happy to take this question. I think that I love that you acknowledge in your question sort of the unconscious biases that people can have. And I think that kind of highlights what my answer is going to be, which is it's all about education, so when you're going to approach these conversations, just going into it with your emotions and what is true in your heart and what you care about isn't always going to work with people who have been molded by society to think a certain way. So I think it's all about having the resources, having the books, having the education, being able to look back at history and contextualize everything, and having those resources on hand when you're going into those conversations. I think that what I think of if you're talking about systemic racism in the United States, something that I would point people to maybe is a book, The New Jim Crow, that talks about how slavery really never ended in the United States, and a lot of Black people are still disenfranchised in a way that emulates slavery through the prison system. I think that is something that, it's a thick book. Even my explanation was kind of wordy, but even if you could find a synopsis online, it will provide you with the context that I think going forward can be really helpful. And I think that it kind of makes me, even being a climate activist, I had to have conversations with my dad about climate denial. And I think they kind of fall into the same realm of a cognitive dissonance of, ignoring some facts that can't really be ignored. I found what helped a lot of the time, and what is important to remember, is that some people really don't see the same information that we see, especially when it comes to our parents and older family members, if we're being really honest. So I think that using the access that we're privileged to have as a generation to a lot of stories and a lot of experience and just a lot of truths is like really good to back up any conversation you go to your family with.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think just personally, when you're talking about parents, maybe elderly, I think my grandfather can make wildly racist comments sometimes, and I think it's a delicate conversation that's kind of hard to maneuver. So I think that just educating, trying to slowly, build into that is a great way to do it. Thank you for that answer. And Toby, would you like to take it away with how do we go around these conversations with our loved ones?
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to have these conversations because it's quite uncomfortable, right, when you're going against what your parents' views are, just the respect of your family. And I always follow a three-pronged approach, and it's educate, inspire, but be an ally. And I think in conversations, before you can, be an ally, you need to access your comfort level, realize what you're comfortable in right now, and then find your discomfort. Because the only way that we can solve these crises or these systemic issues is addressing the discomforts that we have. And that always comes back to having a conversation with our family. And the way that I, as an individual, address that, because I do come from a family that don't support or don't believe in the values that I do, it's very uncomfortable, but be vulnerable and address your emotions. Tell people how you feel, why you feel like that, and tell people why you're an ally from that education that you do. That's how you should address these conversations, because when we can bring emotions into difficult conversations and be vulnerable, we're not being fake. We're being true to ourselves, and people see that, especially our families.
Amazing. I think, Toby, that level of authenticity is what drives us forward as well. We cannot come from a place of anger or frustration, even though that is maybe what we're feeling, and we do have to articulate it. I think, again, going back to what Vic said, bringing in that education level. And then Toby, what you said, also educate. Hang on, I wrote notes here. 3 things: educate, inspire, and be an ally. Being vulnerable, putting yourself out there, coming into conversations, again, with that level of authenticity. Jamie, moving on to you, how would you approach these difficult situations, having conversations with people that don't necessarily see eye to eye? How do you go about this?
Yeah, I mean, the way I go about it, I guess you have to be careful and don't debate the facts, and especially don't debate, when you're talking about especially topics of racism, don't contest. Some people will push back and question whether it even don't even give the privilege of debating facts. Just kind of lay it out and tell stories, and just really storytelling is the best way to put it. And I'd say just meet people where they're at. If there's something specifically that someone cares about, then you can kind of tie it into that. Just kind of know the person that you're talking to and kind of know what they like and what they care about. Also, a lot of people have probably seen instances of environmental injustice, but probably didn't know, you could question. So, the area that coal plant that we always pass that is built, what do you notice about that area and who lives there? Why isn't it built in this other area? And kind of try to tie things to their own experiences. I had an experience like this doing a workshop about environmental justice in South Carolina. A lot of folks were, after I did the workshop with them, they're like, oh my God, I've seen this fossil fuel thing here and this fossil fuel thing here, and it's near this community, and I didn't realize the correlation until you just pointed out. A lot of people see instances of environmental racism in their community, in their life, and don't quite understand the intersections. And so, if you're talking to someone who you know, and or someone who lives in your area, you can like use local cues and local examples that will kind of make them understand. Use stuff that they're familiar with that they can easily tie, because that makes it a lot more palatable than if you go into very like broad overarching topics.
Thank you for that response. The next question that we have for you is, what would be the best way to approach children on this issue?
Yeah, I'd say the best way to approach children with this, I mean, it really depends how young. To an extent, a lot of it is about, educating children about history, then they will make the connections. And then there are also a lot of children who have experienced environmental racism. And so you can kind of, I guess it's difficult because it's almost like, for me, in my experiences giving presentations to like really little kids, part of me is almost like sad that it's like they even have to know this and be burdened with this, because at some age, like you're so young that it's kind of sad that we even have to be having these conversations, but they do have to be had. I don't have a lot of experience talking to mostly when I talk to little children, it's about just generally action and how they can take action. I haven't actually properly had a conversation about environmental racism and environmental injustices with young children. So I can speak from theory, but I actually can't speak from experience. So if anyone has actually had experience with that, because most of the people that I talk to about it are folks my age, like teenagers, and then adults. And then the way that you do it is the way that we just lined it out. But in terms of like young children, I don't know, like Vic, do you have any ideas of like how to have those conversations?
I think what kind of comes to mind to me off top is just teaching empathy. A lot of like the things that kids do, the implicit biases that they have with them, like maybe not hanging out with the kid because they're Black, or things that, society kind of lets them know is normal. I think it's sort of just addressing that head on when they're younger, and basically just intentionally and from day one pointing out that racism is going to be a thing that they're going to see, explaining what it is, why people do that, and like basically just trying to teach them how to avoid being racist, basically teaching them how to avoid not empathizing with other people to the point where you would judge them for the color.
Yeah, I actually saw a survey regarding like young children and racism and implicit bias, and they were asked like what they like. I remember this survey of like this young child, like 3, 4, 5, and they had like different like baby dolls of different skin colors, and they were like, which ones do you trust the most? And these were children of color, and they still picked that the white ones were the ones that they could like when in the message, because they had what they see on TV and what they see like as represented as good is often whiteness. And so even young folks of color are kind of educated like, you are not you're not pretty the way you are, you're not right the way you are. And so even like implicit bias is ingrained at a very young age, as a lot of these surveys show. And even it's not just like white kids, there's also within kids of color, there's a lot of internalized racism and a lot of internalized hatred. And so like, I guess going back to what Vic said, like there are different trainings, I think, for young kids about how to make sure that they're unpacking this and making sure not to grow up with like that mindset. But I think a lot of it also comes with the responsibility of older folks and people who are in charge, like, media representation and the folks around them, teaching them empathy and teaching them a way of life that is different than, the current racist status quo. So I just think that's another thing that I wanted to point out, is that a lot of kids at very, very young age already start to internalize racism. And, when they're 3 or 4, it doesn't come from a malicious place. It's just the society that they're ingrained in. But you have to make sure to go in and like undo that before they grow up to actually, be someone who perpetuates the damage.
Yeah, and Jamie, what you said there, it's clear that we need a change in narrative, a change in the way that media, shares stories. Even like what is interesting to me, and it kind of leads to the question of, what are the barriers from us moving forward? But, the education system, why aren't we learning about these things in school at a lot younger age? Why, Why is that not a normal standard topic or discussions or learnings that we have in our school systems right now? I'd be really interested to hear some of your perspectives. For me, that is one of the challenges or the barriers I see why we're not moving forward. But what are some of the challenges you feel we have in our world right now? Toby, we haven't heard from you. What do you think are some of the challenges and barriers that prevent us from change?
Yeah, I'll touch on both the last two questions, this one and the children's question, because I think from my perspective I think the injustice systems or the perpetuative systems that, continue inequality as always first begins in the classroom. What that also means is that the classroom is the place for change. And I also think young people understand equity and fairness more than any other generation, because it's the first thing you learn at school is how to be fair and how to be equal. And that goes into maths and learning how to add and subtract. All the equations always lead back to fairness and equity. In terms of the barriers in place stopping the world moving forward, I think it's so centralized in our society that it seems too big to change. But I think what we need to do is change that narrative to say, these things have happened before, social movements have happened before, things have changed before. And if it's going to take, and it is a big issue to solve, but if it's going to take a big issue to solve and a lot of work to do, but on the other side is that we can live in a more fair and equal world, then isn't that all worth it? So I think changing the narrative and just the stereotypes and institutionalized or centralized policies and rules and just the way society works is that biggest barrier, is just overcoming that narrative to say this is not normal and we want a new normal. And I think, the current situation in the world has proved that we can change the systems very quickly and very efficiently as well.
Thank you for that answer, Toby. I'd like to pass it on to Vic now. I'm curious as to what you'd have to say about what kind of challenges, what barriers do we face? And I'd just like to remind everyone in the audience that we have the Q&A option coming up soon. So Vic, take it away.
Yeah, I think to me, what it goes back to is education, but not just maybe in the traditional sense, but really unpacking our obsession with like incremental change and little steps that are going to get us places, and really becoming comfortable with the fact that we're going to need to make changes that are uncomfortable and maybe unprecedented. And yeah, I think period, that's kind of my answer.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, just education, even not in the traditional sense. And I want to ask a question now from another question and answer. Katya Prijanka from Jakarta. Since this is a systemic problem and it might take a really long time to fix, as some of you have mentioned before, what is the quickest or most effective way we can reduce the impact of this issue?
I think that the quickest way that we can start to reduce the impact of this issue is to a lot of the violence of environmental racism especially comes from fossil fuel infrastructure and other harmful infrastructure being built that is actively killing communities. This isn't just about unfairness. This is systematic killing, death. People are dying because of this. So I think the most urgent thing that we need to do is to get this fossil fuel infrastructure out of communities, stop the construction of pipelines, stop the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, just halt. The quickest thing that we can do is get together. There's been a lot of mobilizations and momentum against new fossil fuel infrastructure. Almost all of it is being built in vulnerable communities. So getting together and just halting all of this new construction of this, because this fossil fuel infrastructure is bad for the environment. It goes against everything we're fighting for in the climate crisis, but it's also actively killing members of communities. And a lot of times it's built in communities where a lot of people just can't afford to simply move away. A lot of people will say, oh, well, if you don't like it, then move away. But a lot of times people can't afford to just pick up and move. And they shouldn't have to, because that infrastructure shouldn't be there in the first place. So I'd say the quickest thing that we need to do is halt all new fossil fuel infrastructure and all of this new construction and harmful poisons and toxins that are being put into communities, and also halting, there's a lot of environmental racism in terms of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is one of the lungs of our planet. So it's important that we preserve it for the sake of life on Earth, but it's also where a lot of indigenous people call home. And that is not just the destruction of an environment, but it's the destruction of people's homes and cultures and lives. And so halting the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest and other forests and natural spaces around the world that where a lot of communities live, but are also like vital to life on Earth. So I'd say that's like obviously dismantling racism in itself is an ongoing fight, but if you're asking for like a quick thing that we need to do ASAP now immediately, it's halting all of that infrastructure and all of that deforestation that is actively killing people.
Okay, halting infrastructure that is actively killing people. Everyone take notes of this because this is the most effective way we can help out. I would just like to move it on to Vic now to see what answers you would have to this question. Let me just recap it for you. It's what is the most effective way we can reduce the impact of these issues?
I don't know if this is exactly how the question was meant, but for some reason, it's the response that came to my mind. I think because of the nature of kind of what Jamie was saying at the end, like nothing about this is going to feel fast or easy. But I think, especially as young people, we have this like sense of urgency inside of us because we see everything going on and we know something needs to happen. I think the best way to answer to that sense of urgency is definitely about doing the internal work that we were kind of talking about, of unpacking your internal biases, of learning the things that you realize that you don't know, like looking into the corners for the information you don't have. Because, I don't know how realistic it is that any of this will ever feel like it's going much faster, but I think that there's ways that you can make it easier to cope with the speed at which it is going. And that's by like growing and elevating yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I think the internal part is definitely something that, even Malati and I, we came into this, as she mentioned before, as people who want to learn more about this issue and not experts. And I think that this whole talk is definitely something that's going to help educate everybody and change internal biases. Toby, I would like to see if you could take on this question now.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. And I fully back what Jamie and Vic have said, and specifically with fossil fuels. And I just wanted to touch on a term real quick that I'm sure some of you haven't heard before. So take note and learn, is because sometimes in the fight against fossil fuel companies in specific is how can we play our own individual part? And I say we need to decolonize. We need to take ourselves out of the colonial systems to fight that. And just learning about decolonization and practicing that in your own individual mechanism plays a huge role in the fight against fossil fuel companies. But I also think, we need to recognize climate change as a global threat and fossil fuel companies as a global threat. And the World Economic Forum recently has placed fossil fuels or climate change failure at a more global threat than weapons of mass destruction. So we need to change that narrative to say, what does the world think when we say weapons of mass destruction? That's nuclear weapons, armed forces. No one likes that. We need to change that narrative because fossil fuels are projected to have worse impact than these weapons of mass destruction. So we need to reinforce human rights. We need to hold corporations to account. We need to phase out fossil fuels, not just rapidly, but in an equitable way, which means that some countries who depend on fossil fuels can't transition away, rather than companies like the US or Australia or developed countries who do have the infrastructure, money, and science to do so rapidly. And I think, coming back to decolonization, I think it's really important to understand what would you do as an individual if you could start again? And that goes back to the values of YOUTHTOPIA, Malati. I'm sure she recognizes that. But what if we could start again as young people in creating a new world? Decolonize your mind and put yourself in the perspective of what systems would you have in place? How would you operate as an individual to be able to ensure our world and our practices were safe and equitable? And to me, that's the definition of decolonizing. So that's my number one individual action that I think we can all play to speed up this approach.
I love it, Toby. And obviously we're on the same wavelength here because that was going to be my next question to all of you. Before we open it up to Q&As from the audience, I see all of you participants still in here. Thank you for staying with us. And Ba-da-ba-bum, if you guys are wanting to do a question, remember there is an opportunity to be asking these incredible young change makers a question by sharing your video and unmuting when we call on you. Remember, raise hand. But Toby, what you were saying exactly there, individual action, the different ways that these viewers later also when we publish it, I guess one of the questions is also what is the next step for them? How can they take action? And I want to ask Jamie and Vic. Toby, you gave us your your point on this, but what are the next steps? Where can they turn to? Who do they have to look up to? What resources? What are the next steps that young people around the world tuning in can do to take active participation in this topic? Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, I can take it. I guess a lot of what it comes down to is organizing and community organizing and education. So I'll start off with just more general things that you can do, and then I can offer specific resources and places that you can plug in to get involved. So more general things that you can do, I guess, like just harping off of what Vic said, is a lot of internalized, do some work on yourself, read some anti-racist books, and really like do some work on yourself. Everyone has internalized biases. I'll put it, even people who are members of marginalized communities have internalized biases. I'll use an example. I'm gay, and I had a lot of internalized homophobia, even though that is something that is my identity, even though that I am a part of that oppressed group. I still have internalized a lot of the homophobic messages. So I had to do a lot of work in myself, even as a queer person, to unpack that. So if I, as a queer person, still had to unpack queer phobia, then like straight people have even more work to do. And that goes for race, that goes for gender, that goes for everything. Everyone has biases. Having biases doesn't mean that you're maliciously racist. It just means that like we live in a racist white supremacist society, which means that people are going to internalize racism, white supremacy, whether you like it or not. It's not that you're malicious. It's not that you're a bad person. It's just like that's what we live in. But it is our responsibility to do the work to get out of that mindset and to really understand. So I'd say step one is educate yourself. Think of the internalized biases that you have about different groups of people, about race, and do some reading, do some research, and kind of work on yourself and unpack that and try to make yourself better. Because the best that maybe we can't control the actions of others, but we can control how we walk through the world. And if we can walk through the world in a less harmful and more just way, in an anti-racist way, because this is important. It's not enough to just be not racist. You have to be actively anti-racist, because our world that we live in is an actively white supremacist society. So the only proper way to go about that is to be actively anti-racist. Anti-racism looks like a lot of things, and one of the many ways that you can be anti-racist is to do that work within yourself, reading books, unpacking your own biases, finding out what your own biases are, and then working to change them.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And Esta and Emma, our team doing the chat engagement, will be giving and sharing all of the contact details of our panelists joining us today. Vic, turning to you, what are some tangible, active ways that our audience can do to actively participate in the topic of racism and climate change?
I'm gonna try to keep it as tangible as possible, because I guess recognizing, this is an international audience, and everyone has different experiences and fights and struggles going on where they live that maybe don't look like the fights and struggles going on where I live. So I don't want to speak like in a monolith, but I think a safe bit of advice to give out is go into your community, look at where you are, look at who's around you, look at who's struggling, find out the history as to why, and actually that doesn't even really matter. Look at who's struggling and figure out what you can do to help them, because you'd be amazed at how much you can learn that way.
Thank you for that answer, Vic. Sorry. And now I think we're moving on to the Q&A with any questions coming up.
Just jumping in here, Maya, this is one of the most exciting parts. Esta, I'm calling on you and our team to be handling and sending over. I believe we had a question coming in from Lily. If you are joining in on this call, please unmute ourselves. I think while we wait for the logistics to happen, the tangible aspects of what our panelists shared today really starts with educating yourself, but even beyond that, understanding yourself and your internal biases. Being, I think, also open and okay to really study that to a certain extent, to be able to change that. Esta, how are we going with unmuting and sharing? Lily, I see you are here somewhere.
Hi. First off, I'd like to thank all of you for the really insightful sharing. I really learned a lot. And so a lot of you have talked about how, like, as youth, we play a really big role in this whole situation. So my one question to you is, do you really think the youth can change the world? And what do you think is going to happen in like 10 years? Thank you.
Amazing, Lily. What a strong question. Who wants to take that hot potato? Toby, we'll start with you.
I 100% think young people can change the world, and something else to learn about is go look at every social movement to come before us, and every single time in every single situation you'll find a small group of young people passionate about changing the world. And that's what all of you can be part of, is just that small group or very large group at the current stage in the climate crisis. But educate yourself on how has social movements won before, how have young people influenced that, and what took them over the line to actually win. And that might be, gender rights, LGBTIQ rights, workers' rights. There's so many examples. And I promise you, every single time in every single situation, you'll find a group of young people just like you, who at one stage was in the same mindset. What can I do to contribute to this? And they did achieve incredible things, and all of us can do that that's here today.
Exactly, Toby, and that also speaks to the main mission of Youthtopia, to empower a generation of change makers. At Youthtopia, we're going to be giving you tools and resources to be able to have access to incredible change makers like we have on our panel today. Jamie, youth to power. I mean, you also are completely immersed in this topic, and to answer Lily's question, I think the second part, what do you think the world is going to look like in 10 years?
It really depends. It could be really amazing or it could be very terrible. I think we're at a crossroads. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but it's like we are right now at a crossroads where we really get to decide what we want the world to look like. A lot of this is because of the ticking time of the climate crisis. Within the next 10 years, we should have completely transformed to 100% renewable and sustainable agriculture society, because that's within the time frame of what scientists say that we have to change in order to solve the climate crisis. So I mean, if we don't, then it's very grim. But if we do, then within the next 10 years, we could be on the trajectory towards climate recovery and also a more just society, because climate recovery and solving systemic issues such as racism and all of these long existing systemic issues, they go hand in hand. And so we could be on the cusp of a much more just, equitable, sustainable, and beautiful world. But that really depends on a lot of, I think Vic mentioned this earlier about how we have to normalize not focusing so much on incremental change. I think so many politicians are like, oh, we have to take baby steps. But I mean, within 10 years, the time frame that you mentioned, that is the time frame that we have to completely get rid of fossil fuel emissions. So that's not going to take little baby steps. That has to be big sweeping changes. And also issues of racism are incredibly urgent, just like the climate crisis. People are dying every day because of these issues. And so that also is going to take sweeping changes where people, I think this was a, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was a Baldwin quote where he was doing an interview and he was like, it took my grandfather's time, it took my father's time, it took my time. How much more time do you need for your progress? People have been at this fighting for justice for so long that, we really can't wait for incrementalism anymore. So I really hope that within the next 10 years, we have a sustainable world, a just world, but it really depends on the action that we take and also our ability to pressure our leaders, get corporations to be very different than what they are now, or get rid of some corporations and abolish a lot of oppressive systems in order to actually get to where we want to be. So we're on the cusp of some big change, but if we don't make it, then the next 10 years could be just a lot more climate disaster and a lot more suffering. So we have to make sure it's not.
Completely agreed, Jamie. And I actually think that the 10 years is also the goal of the 17 SDGs, which means that we have until 2030. And as you said, the clock is ticking and it's time for youth to make a change. I think 2030 is when we have for all of us to start taking action, making change. So thank you for that answer.
I was just going to say, Vic, do you have anything you want to add to this question before we move on?
Yeah, I would just briefly say, like, I feel like it's it's inherent in young people in our generation, not just young people in general throughout history, but I think specifically our generation has been born into a world where we actively see every day the implications of decades of systems that just don't work and don't work for certain people. We're living at the crux of it right now and seeing what's happening in the United States, seeing COVID and who it disproportionately impacts, seeing countries' inability to answer to it. We're pretty primed to know that a lot of the systems that we have don't work, and I think that guides a lot of our morality, that guides a lot of our fire, and I feel like it's inevitable that when we're the adults of the world, when we're in positions where it's easier to make power, that upbringing is going to impact the way that our society functions.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. It was a big question. And again, thank you, Lily. We are running tight on time, but we have a couple more questions, panelists. I hope that's okay. We're going to unmute and share video from our next speaker, or our next questionnaire, Denaya. Denaya's question to panelists are, I know that there is something called youth power, but I have been discussing with my own friends and NGOs, and I want to ask that, don't you think the real power is through government? So again, that contemplation between where does the power lie to create change, young people versus government, or what is your input perspectives? Toby, I know you have a lot of experience working with government. What's your input here?
I think as a young person, I mean, I can only speak in the sense here, I must disclaim this, that I can only speak in the political sense of being Australian. And I know situations are different in different countries. In Australia, it's compulsory to vote. If you don't vote in an election at the age of 18, you get fined. But in other countries, it's not compulsory to vote. So again, that comes back to educating in your democracy and your political system and how do young people influence governments. But in Australia, from my experience is, yes, young people can influence government, even if we cannot vote. And that comes from the sense that young people have this incredible power to connect with each other across borders as generational peers in local communities, grassroots communities, but also as a global movement. And when that happens, which is not very often if you look in the history of changemakers, governments get scared. The main lesson I can give from the perspective of how young people influence government, because it's totally possible, is that understand your comfort and discomfort and build a tolerance because it's difficult. Governments are scared of young people wanting to make change, whether that be corruption or influence from industries that perpetuate inequality like fossil fuel companies. Governments are scared of you, essentially. And that has to build a tolerance within yourself to continue fighting against that system that's going to continue to put inequality at the forefront because of profit and greed rather than people and ethics. And just through my experience as an Australian advocating for government, it's very, very powerful. And we've had huge wins. But I think I use a tool called power mapping, and it's just mapping who has the power and who has influence. And sometimes when targeting government, it doesn't come back to we need to target our political representatives, but also target corporations that influence these political representatives. And that comes to banks, fossil fuel companies, health companies, production companies. They all have huge influence. They have the money to host a fancy dinner in a restaurant with these political leaders, throwing their words into their ear. We don't, but what we do have is the power of grassroots organizing, the power to connect as a generation, and that's far more powerful than the use of money or tactics that these corporations use.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, just thank you, Toby. Power mapping, a new term. I love it. I can already see that I'll be using it. I think it's a helpful tool to all of our viewers. Thank you, Toby, for that slice of wisdom. Jamie, I know you are needing to go, and we are wrapping up. I had hoped we had enough time for a couple of more questions, but Jamie, I'm going to pass it on to you to kind of give us and the audience a couple of last words and message, maybe towards also the last question of youth power.
I think youth power comes, yeah, thank you. I do have to go soon, but I will leave with this thought. I think youth power comes from obviously we don't hold the money and we don't hold the like political power, you know, the question of like, but the government has the power. That is true. The government has the budget and the power and all of that. But youth power, we have the moral high ground on a lot of issues, and we often have a control of the culture in the sense that we shape the culture, especially pop culture and new and all of that. And so I think our power comes in our ability to leverage that moral high ground that we often have on a lot of issues. You know, young people, what we do have is that we are very untainted in several issues, and that, you know, if young people are speaking up, it isn't usually because of a corrupt motive. There's not much that we can gain from speaking up, and a lot of places around the world it's actually dangerous. And so if a young person is speaking up on an issue, it's not like, oh, because they're making money, oh, because they're doing it for this. There's not usually an alternative motive. It's usually coming from a place of genuine care. And so that really is a lot of power, because when young people speak, people tend to, you know, there's not the same dismissiveness of like, if a professional lobbyist is like lobbying about something, because then it's like, oh, of course they're saying that, they're being paid to. But in a lot of the cases with young people, that's not the case. So our power comes in our ability to be able to leverage our moral high ground and leverage our influence over culture to influence those in power and influence the change. Culture shifts happen before legal shifts can happen. A government, the oppressors are never going to be like, you know what, I'm tired of being the oppressor, here's your rights, have a great day. Like, they're never just going to hand it. And I cannot really think of any time in history where rights and liberties were just like handed people and then people just gave away their power. Like, I've never heard of an instance where that happened. So a lot of times for change to happen, first the culture has to shift. And once the culture shifts enough, then it's like the laws have no choice but to change, because there's so much cultural pressure. And so what we as young people have a job to do is to shift the culture. That comes with education, that comes with activism, that comes with so many other things. Shift the culture, shift the knowledge, and then the laws will have to change with that. So that's really what we have to do. That's where youth power lies in. It is that. So that's really my answer to that question.
I love it. Cultural shift and young people step up. We all have a role to play. Jamie, before you leave, I would ask, and before we give it to Vic to kind of give your last input and your last words as well, I do want to ask, while we have you still on, Jamie, whether everybody can just kind of share video for us to take a group picture. This is something we would love to have all of our speakers in for. So if you hear my voice, please share video if you are comfortable in doing so for our group photo before we end. Hi, everybody. Hello, hello. Hi. Oh my gosh, this is so fun. Wonderful. Okay, while we wait for everybody to just share video. Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for tuning in and sharing your video. Hi, so amazing. Smile. I love seeing all of these faces. So thank you for joining. While we have you guys, just passing it over to Vic. Jamie, I know you need to leave, so thank you. I know it's late evening for you. Thank you for being part of this panel. Vic.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for this. Have a great day or night or wherever you are. Bye.
Vic, while we still have you, do you want to address the last question on youth power, what your input is there as sort of a last remark?
I think it's going to echo what my fellow panelists said, but I think it's really important about understanding the fact that power can mean a lot of different things and can look like a lot of different things. And whether that's governmental power that's actually pushing the policy, kind of like Jamie said, young people do have a really specific power in society. Often we see that society goes out of their way to protect young people, even though sometimes, you know, in terms of the climate crisis, it doesn't ever feel like that. But there is a lot of ways, even if sometimes it feels performative, that society does feel obligated to its younger generations. And I think that there's power in that. And I think that we see the power in that even with looking at the climate strikes that have happened in last year. Young people have a really specific and special way of being able to push the moral compass, which, like we've talked about throughout this call, is totally crucial to making the changes that we need to see.
Thank you so much, Vic, and thank you for both of you for coming to this call and giving us your wisdom and everything you have to say. Toby and Vic, thank you so much. And I just want to quickly wrap up for everybody. It's sad that we only have an hour, but to all of the Youthtopians on this call, we hope to see you at our future webinars. And you can stay tuned on our Instagram for more information. And don't forget to check out our website and all things going on in Youthtopia. Thank you guys. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. No?
Wonderful. Thank you all. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of the weekend. What an incredible discussion and insightful, meaningful Saturday morning, kicking it off here in Bali with all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you again.